Well, hello again, Connecting Point. Today we're going to continue our study in Esther. Last week we met Xerxes and Vashti, the king and queen of Persia. The king is shown to be subject to the whims and insecurities of his advisors, and is unable to make up a ruling without them. These decrees end up perpetuating their fears. We saw that Xerxes had become very unhappy with his queen and chose to replace her. We then met Mordecai and Esther. The story tells us that Esther ends up being named the Queen of Persia. And as these events progress, we see the beginnings of the work of providence. Many actions by our main characters were dubious choices, but the author has omitted any discussion regarding the ethics of these choices. We want to judge their actions, but to do so is to assume details that are not written. The result is a course of human events that will lead us to believe that God had his hand in this all along. He is always working all things to the good of all people. Today we get to meet Haman, the enemy of the Jewish souls. Now, I mentioned last week that this book is read every year to help celebrate the Purim holiday. I found a website that explained how to properly celebrate. It explains that whenever the name Haman is mentioned, that people are boo and hiss and shake noisemakers to show their disdain for Haman every time his name is mentioned. There is also a disclaimer in this webpage that says it was very important for the adults to explain to the children that this was the only time that they're allowed to make noise while they're reading the Bible. We can't have unruly children in the synagogue. So, having said all that, let's start in chapter 3. So, here we go. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to him, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. The royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's demand?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it, to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned at the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Well, that turned dark real quickly. So, if you remember, we ended last week with details of a foiled assassination plot. Mordecai overheard two of Xerxes' closest advisors scheming to kill off the royal king. The conspirators were killed as a result. Now, there are two job openings as the king's closest advisors. Yet our chapter today starts with the promotion of Haman, not Mordecai. One would think that Mordecai would have been the one with the promotion. He saved the king's life. Perhaps if Mordecai had been promoted, this may have prevented the rise of Haman and avoiding this whole ugly genocide issue that is rising up in a few verses of chapter 3. So now, why is Haman upset with Mordecai? It appears to be as simple as Mordecai has hurt Haman's feelings. In fact, it looks like Haman doesn't even notice until someone tells him that he should be offended. The text is vague, and we have no details for Mordecai's refusal to bow. Whatever the reason is, Haman is hot under the collar. Did Mordecai say something? Did he dump his garbage on Mordecai's lawn? Perhaps he's racist and misogynist and has unacceptable views. We don't know. We do know that Haman saw an offense and he chooses genocide for a nation instead of just taking it out on one man, on Mordecai. So who is Haman? First, we are told he's an Agagite. He's the only person in the Bible with that ethnicity. The name Agag only appears twice. The first time is in the time of Moses. Balaam was commissioned by Balak to curse the Israelites. When he tried to do that, his donkey stopped him and told him what for. Afterwards, Balaam returned to Balak and had to give an account for why he didn't curse God. And at this point, he gets a word of knowledge, and it actually becomes a messianic prophecy and tells us that the king of Israel will be greater than the king of Agag. Up to this point in history, Israel doesn't know who Agag is. The next mention of Agag is about 380 years later when Saul becomes king. Now, at this point I'll remind you that Mordecai is a Benjamite, and the great-grandson of Kish. Saul is also a Benjamite and a son of Kish. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul is instructed to annihilate the Amalekites. Israel had to destroy the city, the people, and their possessions. No one was allowed to enrich themselves. Everything must go. The king of the Amalekites was Agag. Now you remember that Saul went to kill the Amalekites, but he let the king live. When Samuel confronted him, Saul covers his rear by saying he did this so that he could sacrifice Agag in a ceremony. Now this is the very reason that God rejected Saul as king, and David appears in the very next chapter. Now given that the name Agag survives 550 years later in our story, I'm going to suggest that Saul failed on a larger scale than just letting Agag live. His children must have survived God's command to wipe out the Amalekites. The story of the Amalekites is also very important to our context. Shortly after Israel left Egypt, they were attacked by the Amalekites. This is the battle where Moses raises up his arms, and as long as his arms are up, Israel had the advantage. When Moses got tired and his arms fell, Israel started to lose. With the help of two other leaders, they propped up his arms and won the battle that day. But after that battle, God promised to wipe the Amalekites off to the face of the earth, so that they will never be remembered. Now consider, as Saul had the opportunity to end the Amalekite threat, but he did not. Now, Israel is in a situation where their very existence is at stake. It's also generally accepted that the Amalekites represent the government systems that oppose the people and the works of God. Some of the governments have periods of cooperation, but in general, all government systems will decline to oppose God's true intent for this world, a world of blessing for all nations. Saul is a good example. He was anointed as the people's choice. He had some success, and then was finally rejected for direct disobedience to God's order to end the Amalekites. He spent the rest of his reign vacillating between loving David and pinning him to the wall. The story of Esther is not about Haman and Mordecai. It's not even about Persians versus the Israelites. This is about the world systems and governments that are against the kingdom of God, that they are against his people and the redemption of the world. One system will be destroyed, and the other will be victorious. So that leads us to a table talk, and I'll ask you this. So what do we make of a government that continuously makes laws that are against God's truth? Now, I'm not simply talking about the current administrations around the world. I'm seeing increasing evidence that governments have been making laws that are plain and simple against God's truth. All parties have participated in this, and they've been doing it for a long time. Is the only answer to get better candidates? Is there another focus we need to have? Discuss that amongst yourselves, and we'll solve the world's problems together. Thanks. Okay, well, again, we solved it all, didn't we? So, so going back to Esther. Now, at this point of our story, the plan is destruction for Israel and victory for their enemies. Now, you'll find this theme from start to finish in the Bible. Cain sees Abel's devotion to God, and he snuffs him out. The Amalekites are the first nation to oppose the people of God shortly after the Exodus. The Tower of Babel and a later iteration Babylon oppose God's chosen people for centuries. They destroy the temple, they take captives and deport Israel to another land. And it works its way all the way through to Revelation. The great dragon himself in Revelation chapter 12 tries to devour the first child of a nameless woman, and when that fails, he persecutes and makes war with the rest of her children, a symbol of the people of God. This is the epic struggle between the world systems that are set up in opposition to the work of God's redemption. When they oppose the people of God, they oppose God himself. Okay, so I'm going to return back to the text, verse 7 here. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month of Nisan, the pure, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in a script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day of the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that they would be ready for that day. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So Haman is not kidding. He is willing to commit genocide just to get the honor he thinks he is due. It is extreme, but not the only such incident in history. The governments throughout history have been very violent in enforcing their ideologies. Sometimes they have to, because their ideas are so bad that the threat of death is the only way to implement them. Funny that the only thing a tyrant needs to succeed is the compliance of the people. So these dates mentioned here are very interesting. Of course, they mean nothing to us, because their calendar, we don't know their calendar. But I will try to explain their significance. In ancient Israel, the first month of the year is Nisan. And as it turns out, in 2022, Nisan 1st was the same day as April 1st on our calendar. So this decree was given on Nisan 13th, and it was a decree of death, destruction of property, and of theft, and a theft of the wealth directed solely at the Jews. But this type of action shouldn't surprise us. Jesus not only warns us of this, but he also does so very directly. And in John 10:10, he tells us that the enemy only comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Haman's decree is satanic in nature, and this death decree is authorized by the king. In fact, he has given Haman his signet ring, passing the authority to Haman to make this decree. With that ring, Haman could now make a decree without the king's knowledge. There is a lot of power in this one ring that rules them all. So this decree was sent on Nisan 13th. Well, Nisan 14th is a very significant day for Israel. The day starts at sundown, the evening before midnight. This is the evening that Israel celebrates the Passover meal. At this point, Israel has already been observing the Passover for almost 1,000 years. God had already made his plan for redemption known to Israel. It has been ingrained into their culture for generations. It is the very heart of their identity. Now, of course, knowing human nature, I would guess that this would not have been much consolation, but the promise was there. You and I have another 2,500 years of history since Esther, and 2,000 years since the fulfillment of Passover in Christ. Perhaps we should take courage in our crazy times and know that we will not be destroyed, but the systems that are against his kingdom will be. Now the death decree was to be carried out on the 14th of Adar. Now this is the last month of the year. Now there's a long period of time, almost an entire year, between the announcement of the death decree to when it was to actually happen. Now think about this. There are 6 feasts listed in Leviticus that were to be an annual observance for all Jews. The first 3 happen at the beginning of the year. These 3 feasts were fulfilled in the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and on the day of Pentecost. Then there are 3 fall feasts that have not yet been fully realized in history. These feasts are observed in September and October of our calendar. Finally, the Feast of Purim is celebrated at the end of the Jewish year, which coincides with March on our calendar. It is always scheduled to be 30 days before the next year's Passover. Now, if the first 3 feasts were foreshadowing real events fulfilled in Christ's incarnation, I will conclude that the last 3 feasts and Purim point to actual events that have been only partially fulfilled or not yet fulfilled at all. This story of Esther shows us that our enemies will get the upper hand and life will look like it is about to end, especially for the people of God. Now before you let that worry you, please wait until we read the rest of Esther. There's some good news to come. So let's get back to chapter 4 here. So when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai, and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the edict for the annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and to explain to her, and he told him to instruct her to go to the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said, and she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them to spare their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So Mordecai has stepped up his game here in this chapter. After word gets to Esther of Mordecai's distress, she inquires why he's moping around. It seems that Haman's authority had bypassed Esther's knowledge. She appears unaware of the death decree pronounced against her and her people. She also knew that to approach the king regarding this matter could mean death for her. But Mordecai wastes no words and lets Esther know that her privileged position will not be able to save her, and that she will die by Haman's decree if she does not speak up. Now this is the point where we see a change in Esther. She now takes control of the situation and works towards a solution. Their first command is to Mordecai with an order for all the Israelites to fast for 3 days. Now I'm seeing an important interaction between Mordecai and Esther. It started in the chapters that we read last week, and it will continue through the end of the book. Last week we saw that Mordecai overheard an assassination plot to kill the king. This is a very important development, but it would not have gone anywhere had Esther not had her position and passed the report on to the king. This week we see that Mordecai is mourning the fact that he and all the Jews are about to be killed off to satisfy Haman's pride. Esther was quite unaware of these events, but learned through Mordecai of the dire situation growing just outside the palace gates. There is a back and forth dependency between Mordecai and Esther that brings about knowledge and a plan to counter this genocide. We've yet to see the results of this plan, but the two working together starts a series of events that will change the course of history. Now I do want to develop the idea of Xerxes as a type of Christ a little bit further. So last week we saw that his rejection of Vashti was similar to God's hardening the hearts of Israel for their rejection of him. We saw that a new bride was chosen. There was significant time of beautification for Esther before she even saw the king. Today I want to focus on the fact that Xerxes gave his signet ring to Haman once Haman proposed the annihilation of the Jews. Now when mankind rebelled against God, this gave opportunity to our mortal enemy to steal, kill, and destroy our very existence. We can look at our sordid history and see our own depravity in all of this. But let's make no mistake that there is a spiritual realm that is taking every chance it can get to provoke and taunt us. It is as if we are slaves to sin and have our minds set on the flesh, on what the flesh desires, just as Romans 7 teaches us. This also reminds me of the story of Job, where Satan asked permission to provoke Job and God allowed it. Some authority was given to the demonic realm to test us, to sift us, to provoke us. Fortunately, this does not last, and all these enemies will be turned into a footrest for the throne of Jesus. So in our passages today, we saw the conflict between the world governmental systems and the people of God. Life and death is at stake. It is a serious game. World history has shown us that those outside of God's redemptive plan are ruled by their pride. They cannot stand the challenge to their authority, and their pride causes them to seek their authority. They cannot stand the challenge to their authority, and their pride causes them to seek and destroy those who will not bow to their standards. As it now stands in our story, the plan is to wipe out the people of God. There is no plan B. Esther is in a position to speak up to the king, but that could possibly mean death. Staying silent is a sure death, Speaking up likely means death, but there is a chance the king could relent. Can he be convinced to overturn an irrevocable decree? Will he provide a way to overcome the death decree? Well, we'll have to come back next week to see what happens. So, again, we'll go to our final table talk as we go. Just think about this for a little bit. So, the best known statement in all of Esther is Mordecai's encouragement to Esther. But who knows that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this? So last week we talked about being God's workmanship, created for good works in Christ. Do you see that you are here for such a time as this? How do we start to live a life of good works with these two statements as our motivation to serve the world? So pray for each other and have a good week. We'll see you again next week.